War by Other Means, Israel, Hamas, and Media Coverage of Gaza. My name is Tamar Sternthal, and I'm Director of CAMRA's Israel Office. CAMRA, or Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, is a research, media monitoring, and activist organization of 65,000 members which leads the fight against anti-Israel media bias. Founded in 1982, our mission is to ensure that media outlets adhere to their own professional codes of journalistic conduct. Along with our Boston headquarters, we have additional offices in half a dozen American cities, as well as here in Jerusalem. CAMRA has been active in Israel for a decade, and we are just now celebrating the one-year anniversary of the opening of our physical office in Jerusalem. In recent years, CAMRA has greatly expanded its global reach by establishing our British division with our two popular blogs, BBC Watch and SIF Watch, our Spanish division with the Revista website, and our Hebrew division, Perspectiva. Our record of success speaks for itself. CAMRA has prompted literally hundreds of corrections in erroneous reports in print, online, and in broadcast. Our researchers also set the record straight by penning op-eds in a variety of leading media outlets, by appearing on television and on radio, and also by communicating privately with journalists. The impact of our talented professional staff is enhanced by the critical work of our dedicated volunteer team. Thousands of letter writers, people just like yourselves, who advocate for fair and professional coverage of Israel, and whose letters are published in national and local media outlets, reaching a vast audience. This is our second event in the last year here at the Begin Center. We extend our deepest wishes for a full and speedy recovery to Yehuda Glick, the victim of attempted murder, right here outside the Begin Center less than 2 weeks ago. Media coverage of recent violence in Jerusalem and of tensions surrounding the Temple Mount, much of it flawed, underscores the importance of CAMRA's vital work. This summer, Hamas worked hard to ensure that its messages dominated the media. But our professional and volunteer teams were up to the challenge. Together, we worked literally around the clock to call out the media on factual errors, distorted coverage, and key omissions. And, as we'll see later tonight, in many instances, our efforts were rewarded in this war by other means. I cannot think of a more suitable person than Arnold Roth to moderate tonight's program on anti-Israel bias and how we can make a difference. Arnold got started as an advocate for Israel during the early 1970s on Australia's university campuses. Born and raised in Melbourne, he was a lawyer there until he and his wife Frimet made Aliyah to Jerusalem in 1988. In 2001, their teenage daughter Malka Chana was one of 15 people murdered in a Hamas attack on a pizza shop teeming with children. Frimet and Arnold established a very active foundation in her memory, Karen Malki, for the benefit of children with special needs. The couple has written widely, as well as spoken to political figures, journalists, and public audiences throughout the world, explaining their views on the impact that terrorists are having on democracies and on the lives of ordinary people that are their targets. Arnold, I give you the floor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a busy evening, a great deal of thought-provoking material which is sure to go flying, and some sincerely, genuinely substantive speakers to address us this evening. If we imagine, like our friends and family living far away, that war by this means or that means happens to other people in other places, this venue and the drama to which it played host a mere 2 weeks ago, as Tamara just mentioned, reminds us again that war of the kind that preoccupies the Jewish people in its homeland is well and truly upon us. There are no innocent bystanders. All of us are in it. There's a video which is going to set the tone for the discussion ahead. It shows one of the two leaders of Hamas. Is it just going to go and say go? Yep. One of the two leaders of Hamas addressing the issues of war, victory, and media. It only goes for a minute and a half, but I urge you to just pay close attention to the use of words. You don't need to know Arabic. It's translated with subtitles. Follow those three things: war, victory, and media.
احنا كمان انتصرنا اعلاميا في هذه الحرب. هذه الحرب كان النصر نصر عسكري، والنصر العسكري حسم قبل ان تنتهي الحرب. نصر عسكري ونصر سياسي ونصر اعلامي ايضا، ونصر اخلاقي ايضا، نصر قيمي. نحن كنا نخوض ايضا معركه في عالم القيم وفي عالم الاخلاقيات. لذلك الشعب الفلسطيني انتصر في هذه المعركة عسكريا وسياسيا وإعلاميا. الرواية الإعلامية كانت الرواية الأقوى، الرواية الإعلامية كانت الأصدق، الصورة الإعلامية كانت الأبلغ، التحليل الإعلامي، رجال الإعلام في كل المواقع شكلوا النهر الذي يستقي منه الإعلام العالمي كل ما يدور على هذه الأرض. حتى المجتمع الصهيوني نفسه ما عاد يصدق رواية القادة ولا رواية الجيش الإسرائيلي، وكان يأخذ أخباره من إعلامنا الفلسطيني المقاوم الملتزم.
War, victory, and media. I hope you're keeping track, but in case you weren't, media was the one that you mentioned the most, and perhaps at the end of the 2 hours that we're going to spend together, all of us will come to an appreciation as to why that is. We have 5 speakers about to rise to the podium and address us. I'm going to describe each of them briefly, and then once they start speaking, we hope that this is going to move very quickly. Only 2 hours, but we want to pack a lot into it. At the end of the formal speaking, there's going to be an opportunity for Q&A. I know that it's an English-speaking audience, but I'm going to explain that the Q part of the Q&A stands for questions, and I'm going to be a little bit harsh in case people understand Q to mean something else. The first of the speakers, whom we've already had a preview of, is Tamar. Tamar Sternthal is the director of Camera's Israel office, and since joining Camera in 1999, she regularly communicates with editors at major media outlets such as the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, CNN, National Public Radio, and the Associated Press, and has elicited countless corrections in print and on air. She established Camera's activity in Israel in 2004, and today she and the office monitor, among other outlets, the English language Israeli daily Haaretz, and Tamar writes for Camera's media report, providing frequent media updates for the organization's website. She was formerly the associate editor of the Jewish Advocate of Boston, and her columns for Camera have appeared in Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, Ynet, Allgemeiner, Philadelphia Daily News, St. Petersburg Times, and the Jewish Journal of Greater Los Angeles. Speaking after Tamar will be Hadar Seller. We're moving down the table. Hadar is the managing editor of BBC Watch. Born in the north of England, she's lived in Israel for over 3 decades. She came here when she was 0. She has a special interest in the influence of the media on the British public's perceptions of the Middle East and the Islamist networks operating in the UK. Hadar has written reports on several anti-Israel campaigns, including the flotillas and the global march to Jerusalem in March 2012. Hadar joined CIF Watch, which focuses, as many of you will know, on The Guardian, shortly after its establishment in 2009, and has had her work published in the Allgemeiner, the Commentator, the Merrier Journal, and on the Harry's Place website, among others. Speaking after Hadar will be Richard Landis. Professor Richard Landis is Professor of History at Boston University. Trained as a medievalist, his early work focused on the period around the year 1000 CE, a moment which, in his opinion, marked the cultural mutation, meaning the origins of the modern West, as well as an intense apocalyptic and millennial, a moment of intense apocalyptic and millennial expectations. His most recent publications include Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, published by Oxford University Press in 2011, and The Paranoid Apocalypse, a 100-year retrospective on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, published by NYU Press in that same year. In 2005, Richard launched a media oversight project called The Second Draft, in order to look at what the news media called their first draft of history. His opening dossier was Pallywood and the Muhammad al-Dura affair. Since January 2005, Richard has been blogging at the Augean stables. In 2009, just after the publication of the Goldstone Report, he and other critics put up a website dedicated to understanding the Goldstone Report. He and a number of associates are currently engaged in creating the Institute for Cognitive War Research. His first project is to establish the Al-Dura Project. He's currently writing 2 books, one on the early Middle Ages, While God Tarried, Disappointed Millennialism from Jesus to the Peace of God, and one about the current situation, which he calls They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, a medievalist's guide to 21st century cognitive warfare. Speaking after Richard will be Gidon Shaviv, who since 2013 has been working as a senior research analyst at Perspectiva, an Israeli NGO dedicated to promoting accuracy in the Israeli media and has published numerous op-eds in Israel as well as in international papers. Gidon is a litigator and currently a PhD candidate in international law at Bar-Ilan University, specializing in humanitarian law. Our last speaker of the 5 will be Ben-Dror Yemini, who was born in Tel Aviv, studied humanities and history at Tel Aviv University and later on law. After university studies, he was appointed advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Immigration Absorption and then became the spokesman of the ministry. He began a career as a journalist and essayist, and in 2003 became the opinion editor of the daily newspaper Ma'ariv. Also published many articles and essays in other journals. In recent years, Ben-Dror Yemini researched and published many articles about the industry of lies, which is going to be a big part of the theme which he'll be addressing here this evening. The endless publications against the state of Israel and its Jewish character, which he considers false. In this framework, he published a series of research articles about the Israeli-Arab conflict in which he examined the issues of genocide, refugees, human rights violations, the status of Israeli Arabs, multiculturalism, and the status of women. We're going to get started with tomorrow, but I want to just make a brief mention before I sit down of the way in which we address the various chapters in the state of war with our enemies. We've come through a difficult summer in which we grew accustomed to hearing reports about Mivtza Tzuk Eitan, Operation Protective Edge. Our enemies don't necessarily, however, view the conflict with us as a sequence of operations, and this is a reason why my wife and I, in that part of our lives devoted to expressing political views, choose to write a blog not called Operation This or Project That, but This Ongoing War. And from a personal perspective, though many of us would like to think of these as a series of wars that we keep winning, in a certain sense, this really is an ongoing war, a war which has a certain character which we're going to address frontally right now. And I call upon Tamara to open the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold, for that introduction. Can we please back up to the frame that was around this video? Thank you. To what degree is Hamas's claim of victory in the Gaza media war justified with respect to American news coverage? In order to answer this question, let's look back to the guidelines that the Hamas Interior Ministry issued to the local social media activists in the Gaza Strip over the summer. Hamas urged local activists to always identify casualties as innocent civilians, to avoid photographs of rockets being fired from residential areas, to avoid photographs of armed and masked men, and to always cast doubt on the Israeli version of events. Over the next few minutes, we will see how these elements seeped into and shaped American news coverage. Let's start, next slide please, with the casualty issue. Specifically, how many of those killed over the summer in the Gaza Strip were innocent civilians, and how many were combatants fighting for Hamas or other terror organizations? This question goes to the heart of the basic allegation leveled by Hamas and other terrorist and others, like the spokesman for the Palestinian Authority, Nabil Shah, that there is a war against the Palestinian people. For several weeks, Hamas was successful in making its figures the figures cited by the media. And I'm going to show you now a brief clip of a spokesman for the PA, Nabil Shah, who was interviewed on July 25th on CNN, and we'll see how veteran journalist Wolf Blitzer fails in his journalistic obligation to challenge Shah on his inflated figures for Palestinian casualties, civilians. Let's watch that video.
There is no war against Hamas. There is a war against the Palestinian people. 1,000 Palestinians in Gaza have already been killed. 700 of them are women, children, and elderly civilians.
Is it true, as Shah claimed, that at the time of the 1,000 Palestinians killed, 700 were women, children, and elderly civilians? An analysis of the data published by the Palestinian Center for Human Rights showed that Shah was off by hundreds. Stephen Statsky, a senior research analyst for Camera in Boston, pored over the names, ages, and genders of these casualties which had been published by this Palestinian group and found that at most there were 300 women, children, and elderly civilians who had been killed. Moreover, Steve found that a disproportionate number of the casualties were young men between the ages of 17 and 31. Next slide. Though this group makes up less than 10% of the total population of the Gaza Strip, they constituted 44% of the overall number of casualties. And this statistic completely belies the claim of Hamas and Shah that Israel was carrying out a war against the Palestinian people. Statsky published his findings on the website of Time magazine, and this piece had a tremendous impact on subsequent discourse on the topic. For instance, click, please. Next, no, back. Next arrow. For instance, he was cited and relied upon by the Washington Post. Next one, United Press International, and others. Camera cited his research and communication with top editors at leading media outlets, and the impact was seen a couple days later with, for instance, this article in the New York Times, Civilian or Not, New Fight in Tallying the Dead from the Gaza Conflict. Now, the article wasn't perfect. It did bury the key finding that there was a disproportionate number of young men who, and this is both the age and the gender in which you would most expect combatants. That was buried deep down in the story. Also, the article never did mention that Hamas had instructed its people to cover up losses among its fighters. Nevertheless, the very fact that the New York Times did this story is already a step forward. And the reason why I say that is because this last round of conflict over the summer in the Gaza Strip was not the first time that we saw a terrorist organization fighting in asymmetric warfare and trying to conceal the extent of the losses that it suffered among its fighters and to pass them off as civilians. Camera first noted and documented this phenomenon back in 2006 in the context of the Lebanon War when Hezbollah did the exact same thing. The difference between then and now is that at the time, Camera was one of the very few sources that was discussing this topic. Now, the conversation about combatant versus civilian is widespread, and the fact that even major mainstream media outlets, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, felt compelled to deal with the subject is already an indication of a step forward. Now, I'd like to move on to the next two directives that Hamas issued to its local activists. They both have to do with photographs, and we can move to the next slide, right where we are. The directives were to avoid photographs of rockets being fired from residential areas and to avoid photographs of armed and masked men. The powers at be at Hamas would not have been happier with the photo gallery that was published on the website of the Los Angeles Times during the summer. This was featured on the homepage and attached to every article on the conflict. We checked in when there were 75 pictures, and the collection constantly grew. A couple days later, it was up to 99. And viewers of this collection would have no idea that Israel was fighting a terrorist organization which had launched thousands of rockets at it. The story was strictly between the Israeli military versus the innocent civilians of the Gaza Strip. In fact, Hamas was literally not in the picture. There was not one single photograph of a Hamas fighter dead or alive, and not one single photograph of Hamas weaponry. More than that, out of 99 captions, the word Hamas appeared not one time. So the overwhelming images that we saw are pictures of casualties. We can click to the next photograph. And these are definitely part of the story. The losses and the devastation on the Palestinian civilian side, which were a result of the war inflicted on both sides by Hamas, are part of the story. But to leave Hamas out of the story altogether is a total distortion of what had happened. Next slide, please. The only indication that we had that Hamas was fighting anyone other than the innocent civilians of the Gaza Strip were two photographs, and click to the next one as well, showing Israeli soldiers who were showing the Hamas tunnels to journalists. And the captions do not mention the tunnels. Unfortunately, I'd expected to have the computer in front of me, and I don't, so I can't see the caption. It says something about an Israeli soldier takes journalists to see tunnels said to be used for cross-border attacks. So that's the key that you have to get out from this caption, that this is a tunnel said to be used by cross-border attacks. And the second caption also uses this qualifying language. By this time, Hamas had already used these tunnels. It was widely reported that fighters had snuck under the border, emerged deep into Israeli territory, and carried out lethal attacks against Israeli soldiers, killing many. So the fact that the Los Angeles Times resorts to this language, which really casts doubt on the Israeli version of events, which have already been proven as true, dovetails with the fourth Hamas directive, which was to always cast doubt on the Israeli version of events. Next slide, please. The last element of this photo gallery, which is worthy of mention, is the fact that, as I said, this was a story of the Israeli military fighting the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. The civilians of Israel were almost completely absent. So we had, out of 99 pictures, two photographs, let's flip to the next one, of Israeli civilians, one of them of counter-demonstrations in Tel Aviv, the others, which does actually represent the hardship that Israelis face. Israelis taking shelter in a tunnel. Let's click to the next two images. Another one. Oh, no, go back. So this puts Israeli images on par with the animals who are suffering hardship in the Gaza Strip. The Los Angeles Times posted two photos of animals suffering hardship as a neglect as a result of hunger, as a result of the conflict, equal number of photographs dedicated to Israeli civilians. But there is a silver lining here, and that is that we did not allow Hamas to get the last word in terms of what images and what messages would be available to the audience. Camera documented this gross misrepresentation of the conflict in two analyses that were widely read, shared, and cited. Other journalists used it. We wrote directly to the editors of the Los Angeles Times. We sent an alert to our amazing team of volunteer letter writers. And as letters from the public, people like yourselves, wrote in to the editors of the LA Times, they began to add, next slide please, the photographs and captions which had previously been so conspicuously absent. Two more clips. Now the final photograph is of a rocket interception being shot down by the Iron Dome. Images like this one and images of those rockets that made it past the Iron Dome and landed in Israeli territory causing damage. All of these images were available from day one of the conflict, and they were only included once members of the public, news consumers like yourself, spoke out and insisted that they be included. I'd like now to spend a few minutes to talk about the most influential American media outlet, and that's, of course, the New York Times. The Times does shape the tone and content of much of the rest of media coverage in the United States and even beyond. Last year, we published a groundbreaking monograph detailing 6 months of New York Times Arab-Israeli coverage. The name of the monograph is Indicting Israel, and we have it outside for free, along with Ben Jorah's book being sold in Hebrew, not for free, but we hope you'll buy it anyway. And in the monograph, we found that there's a disproportionate, continuous, embedded indictment of Israel that dominates both news and commentary in the New York Times. We empirically demonstrated the New York Times bias by showing that it devoted twice as much space to criticism of Israel as it devoted to criticism of the Palestinians. The Times' obsessive focus on the Israeli culpability and the downplaying of any Palestinian responsibility for the conflict was also apparent through much of the coverage that we saw this summer. And I'd like to show you bookend examples, one from the beginning of the fighting, the beginning of the violent events of the summer, and one from the end. So let's go to the next slide. This news story came out a couple days after the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenagers when Israel was in the midst of a massive manhunt to try and save the boys. And the New York Times wrote in the news story, the growing search for them and their captors further destabilized Israeli-Palestinian relations. So as the Israeli rescue attempt to save the 3 boys, which was responsible for endangering Israeli-Palestinian relations, but the initial Palestinian belligerent act of kidnapping 3 youngsters, apparently in the New York Times opinion, had no effect or harm on Israeli-Palestinian relations. We called out the Times, again, for this egregious example of partisan reporting in a piece that we wrote in Times of Israel that went viral. And as a result, we noted that the New York Times did take note. Subsequent articles, for instance, let's click to the next slide, did refer to the kidnapping as contributing to deteriorating Palestinian-Israeli relations. I'd like to now fast forward to the final example, and this comes from towards the end of the fighting when both Israel and Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire, and Hamas quickly broke the ceasefire with a series of rockets that it fired into Israel. And the headline was, "Rockets said to be fired from Gaza Strip puncture the latest ceasefire." Notice the passive language, the absence of identifying the perpetrator, and those rockets that are said to be fired, which I suppose are like tunnels that are said to be used for cross-border attacks. This headline was subsequently revised and only moderately improved. Click, please. To rockets from Gaza and Israeli response break ceasefire. So at least the rockets have been upgraded from purported rockets to actual rockets. On the other hand, we still have passive language, and the Israeli response to the initial Palestinian aggression are on the same footing as being equally responsible for breaking the ceasefire. And this is parallel to the example I showed you before of both the kidnapping and the aftermath, the search effort, as being equally responsible for endangering Palestinian-Israeli ties. One final troubling trend at the New York Times that I'd like to note is that the paper of record has increasingly permitted fringe extremist voices to penetrate into the mainstream discourse. Next slide, please. And this is most apparent in the writing of Robert Mackey, who blogs at the New York Times, The Lead. We documented how from the beginning of May through July 25th, he wrote about the Arab-Israeli conflict 12 times. 7 of them, he cited the radical writer Ali Abu Nima of the anti-Israel blog or website Electronic Intifada. Abu Nima favors terms like Zionist butcher regime, cowardly murderous cabal of a psychotic apartheid settlers colony, and the contributors to his website are no less extreme. For instance, Rana Bakr tweeted after the capture of the kidnapping of the 3 teens, "Wonderful, wonderful news that 3 settlers have been kidnapped. Celebrations, celebrations." Abu Nima defended her, and this is the man that the New York Times deems as an appropriate voice to constantly inform its readers about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Next slide. So as you can see, the campaign next slide please. Camera is undergoing a sustained campaign to expose and seek redress of the New York Times bias. This is the billboard that is across the street from the New York Times building in Times Square. It is the 3rd in a series of billboards that we have run, and every reporter and every employee of the New York Times sees it every time they enter and exit the building. I'd like to close by going back to the words of Ismail Haniyeh when he posted victory. He had said, "Our narrative has gained the upper hand and was more credible." On the one hand, he's right to an extent. In many instances, Hamas achieved its goals in getting the media to accept its casualty figures, and getting the media to overlook certain images, and for getting the media to call the Israeli version of events into question. On the other hand, there is a countercurrent which we identified. Compared to previous conflicts, there was more mainstream coverage of the very topics that Hamas would rather have avoided: the casualty debate, human shields, intimidation, and the latter trend is cause for optimism and underscores the tremendous impact and value of the work of camera and concerned individuals like yourselves. You all have the power to help us ensure that Hamas does not gain the upper hand in the next battle in this war by other means. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm sure I don't need to introduce the BBC, the world's biggest broadcaster, the world's most influential broadcaster, and a broadcaster which you can find quoted in academic papers, quoted by other members of the media. It's a very big business. A little bit of context, next slide. The BBC, even in quiet times, has a disproportionate focus on Israel. We've been doing quantitative analysis of the BBC News website coverage of the Middle East for the last 20 consecutive months. The only country defined as free in the Middle East, Israel, is always in the top 5 of coverage, member coverage. Israel receives more coverage, except for Syria, than all the countries defined by Freedom House as not free, all of them put together, and more coverage than all of the countries defined as partly free except for Egypt. Why does this matter? Because the BBC in 2012, they did a report on their own coverage, a review of their own coverage of what they call the Arab Spring, and they admitted that they were focusing too much on Israel, and so they missed the Arab Spring story. That hasn't changed. Next slide, please. So, of course, it was no surprise when the conflict broke out in the summer to find them disproportionately focusing on Israel yet again. A little bit of numbers. Operation Protected Edge, from July 8th to August 27th. This is just the website coverage, not television, not radio, just the website coverage. And there were a total of 416, or actually more, 416 items relating directly to the conflict. There were actually more things that were related to political commentary in the UK about the conflict and things like that. That's not included here. So a total of 416 items. Next slide, please. Predominant headlines. Gaza crisis, Gaza conflict. 30% of those 416 items were titled Gaza crisis or Gaza conflict, and then maybe something after that. If you add Middle East crisis and Middle East conflict, and let's remember that just over the border from where I live in the Golan Heights, 700 people were killed in Syria in the first weekend of Operation Protected Edge, but of course this is the Middle East crisis, the Middle East conflict, then that made up 35% of the headlines. From day 1 it was called Gaza conflict, from day 4 of coverage, Gaza crisis. Permutations of headlines, including both the words Israel and Gaza, made up 5% of the headlines alone. In other words, the audiences were being focused on this story as a crisis in Gaza. There were no headlines which talked about an Israel crisis, and as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, even when things were happening in Israel, it was still a Gaza crisis. One very interesting factor in BBC coverage was that there were entire periods of time without any sort of coverage from Israel at all. In the last 20 days of the conflict, between August 8th and August 16th, there was no reporting from Israel at all by the BBC. BBC viewers of television, BBC television news, and visitors to the website actually saw nearly 3 times more content from the Gaza Strip as they did from Israel with regard to what was happening with civilians. Another very interesting point was that there was no BBC reporting of injuries to Arab Israelis. The one exception was Ouda Lafi Al-Waj, who was killed near Dimona on July 19th, but rockets that fell in Beit Hall, the Arab Israeli taxi drivers who were injured at Erez Crossing, those stories were omitted from BBC coverage. It was covered like a natural disaster, as if BBC had gone to an earthquake zone and decided to cover this like a natural disaster. Total lack of context. One very important, and I think it's a very significant factor, is that the vast majority of reporters have actually no military knowledge. They're covering a war, but they have no military knowledge. Now, here in Israel, our military reporters, Alon Ben David or Elio, they know what they're talking about. So, battles weren't explained. To this very day, the BBC still hasn't explained to its audiences what happened in Shujaya. And technical issues, there was a radar system photographed and put on the BBC website, and you could describe as Israel's firepower. It's a radar system, it doesn't shoot anything. Lots of death and destruction, of course. As Tamar was saying, same focus on the civilian population. The BBC found an English teacher called Abu Ahmed in Shujaya who likes Jane Eyre. That immediately connected him to his English audiences. He's been interviewed dozens of times on multiple BBC platforms. Nobody has ever mentioned that missiles were fired from right by his house. Another interesting factor was that Israeli spokespeople and politicians were interviewed nearly 3 times more than Palestinians. No Hamas leaders in Gaza were interviewed by the BBC. 2 spokespeople were, but not Hamas leaders throughout the whole conflict. So we can have the next slide, please. War crimes. How long do you think it took the BBC to start using the word war crimes, crimes against humanity, collective punishment? Well, the answer to that's less than 24 hours. On the second day, they were already pushing the idea, the notion that Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza. And one of their favourite interviewees was Raji Surijani from the PCHR. He appeared on multiple BBC platforms, and this was a theme that was pushed throughout the entire conflict, together with similar messages from other organisations such as the ISM, Al-Mizan, Human Rights Watch, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The style of reporting, lots of very, very graphic imagery. This is just from one film report by Jeremy Boyd. You can see pictures from the morgue at the bottom there. Now, I think this is a really important point, because in the UK, that wouldn't be shown. If that footage had been filmed in the UK, it wouldn't have been filmed in the UK for a start, it wouldn't have been shown on BBC television. BBC does not show pictures of dead bodies and morgues in Britain, but it does show them in Gaza. And I think that's a very, very significant point. Next one, please. And if anybody can guess what that picture is, that's the only picture of a member of Hamas throughout 7 weeks of BBC coverage. And he's keeping watch, and he has a walkie-talkie. He's not actually doing anything nasty. The first, and it's probably the last as well, practically the last, report of missile fire from a residential area in the Gaza Strip came on the 12th of August. That was a month into the conflict, 36 days into the conflict. Of course, the narrative was well established by then. Can we have the next one, please? The public has been complaining about this. The public has been writing to the BBC throughout the conflict and since, and this is one of the typical response we've seen, because people write to us and tell us the responses they've been getting from the BBC. It was very hard for journalists in Gaza to see the rockets being fired out. That's the response. As is the case with other media outlets, ceasefire breaches by Hamas were misreported. They just ended ceasefires. Nothing happened, they just ended. Human shields, next one please. The issue of human shields was not reported, it was even denied by the BBC. We know it happened. We have Hamas saying it happened. But the BBC pushed the line that it didn't. And of course, it's not just articles, it's articles in other outlets, and it's social media as well. So you get BBC reporters spreading or exacerbating the idea that there were no human shields in the Gaza Strip. Next one, please. The business of the issue of Hamas censorship or Hamas control of the media. The BBC denies very strongly that it was put under any sort of pressure to tailor its reporting or not report certain things or so on and so forth. My personal guess is that Hamas didn't need to say anything to the BBC, and they were very compliant of their own accord. We have to remember they're the only media outlet with a permanent office in Gaza which employs local people. I would imagine that puts the BBC in a difficult position sometimes, but nevertheless, we saw during the Iraq War, we saw, for instance, that when the BBC was limited in its reporting by the regime there, it would say, this is what we can report, this is what we are allowed to report. It didn't do that in Gaza. These are quotes from BBC correspondents. The program called From Our Own Correspondents on BBC Radio 4. And as you can see, the language used is language that we expect very often from anti-Israel campaigners: collective punishment, open-air prison, so on and so forth. Next one, please. The BBC took it upon itself, I call it self-conscription, to extensively, very extensively promote Hamas's demands with regard to a ceasefire, and especially with regard to the siege, which is Hamas language. We all know there isn't a siege on Gaza. No context whatsoever was given as to why there were border restrictions on Gaza. BBC audiences, as far as they're concerned, the Israelis woke up in a bad mood one morning and decided to put a blockade on Gaza. Next slide, please. With regard to casualty statistics, again, as Tamar mentioned, the BBC also quoted exclusively Hamas, the Hamas Health Ministry, although they didn't call it the Hamas Health Ministry, they called it the Gaza Health Ministry, and the UN. I did some research into where the UN gets its statistics. I actually rang them up and asked them. And they told me they get them from the PCHR, which was the same man who before one day into the conflict was telling BBC audiences that Israel was committing war crimes, and from Al-Mizan, and from the Hamas Health Ministry. So these independent and unbiased UN statistics aren't quite what they're made out to be. On August 8th, something very interesting happened. The BBC suddenly, a month into the conflict, yes, the BBC suddenly put out this article, Caution Needed with Gaza Casualty Figures. Now, they've been getting a lot of pressure, particularly on social media, from people like me and other people as well, members of the general public, who had been, when they sent out tweets with reports saying 100 people killed in Gaza, would quite simply been returning a tweet and asking how many were terrorists. Of course, they didn't reply. But suddenly on the 8th of August, this article appeared. It was written by the BBC's head of statistics. It was called Anthony Rule. It was extensively quoted by the Israeli press and even by some government officials, I think, as sort of reinforcement of our side of the story, of our narrative. And then, next slide please, 3 days later, something happened. That article was quietly and surreptitiously changed completely. Thank you. The essence of the article was changed. The focus on male young people being among the highest group of people killed was erased. And BBC audience were told that that might be explicable because they were going to the shop, basically. Next slide, please. Why did that happen? Why was that article changed? Well, here's a clue. Here's a series of tweets from the UNRWA spokesman, Chris Gunness, who is also an ex-BBC employee, by the way, who had a bit of a Twitter campaign going until that article was changed. As I said before, it was changed quietly. It was only noted on August 15th, 4 days later, that actually any change had been made to that article. Next one, please. I want to talk a little bit, we talk about Hamas and how Hamas's narrative was dominant in this conflict, but Hamas doesn't operate alone. Hamas has an entire support system in Europe, and part of that support system is the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. This is a letter they sent to the Director General of the BBC, trying to get the man who wrote the article on casualties, the head of statistics, banned from writing about Israel and Palestine, because they say he's not objective. Those two leaders of the PSC, you can see them up there, Hugh Lanning, Sarah Colburn, meeting Ismail Hamas in Khania. So this is Hamas's support. Next one, please. Hamas's support group in the UK, one of them. The PSC also organised a lot of demonstrations in the UK during the conflict, and those were covered very extensively by the BBC. You can see that that's a screenshot from a BBC television report. You see the guy with the sign behind. That BBC audiences saw that for 2.5 minutes. I mean, the camera could have been moved, but that was broadcast on BBC News. It's obvious that the support groups in Europe are really, really important. And what the BBC actually did, next slide please, is to build a consensus, what it didn't do, first, is report what happened at these demonstrations organised by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Here's some of the anti-Semitic imagery that was used at those demonstrations. Not only did it not report it, it actually gave the head of the PSC a platform to deny that any anti-Semitic imagery used at their demonstrations. Next, please. And what the BBC actually did, and I think this is tremendously important, it created a consensus. It created an impression among the British public that Holocaust deniers were shocked by what was happening in Gaza. The UN was shocked. Daniel Barenboim, artists, musicians were shocked. Save the Children, politicians, everybody was shocked about what these horrible Israelis were doing. That created a false impression in Britain that there was a consensus about this war. What did that lead to? You can see on the right, British MPs voted to recognise the Palestinian state. Would they have done anyway? Perhaps. Did it make the job of the people lobbying for that easier? A lot. Thank you.
Remnants here of 1 minute left, 3 minutes left. Let's see if I can avoid getting those. I'd like to start with a story which I have a good friend here in Jerusalem this year, Gabriel Bram, and he reads Zizek. Those of you who don't read him, don't bother. In any case, he tells an interesting story about a man who goes into a totalitarian society and he says, I'll write you back from the society. What I write back in black ink is lies, and what I write back in red ink is the truth. So sure enough, about 2 months later, his friend back in the free world gets a letter, and it's all in black ink. I'm going to give you my Palestinian version of this. Things are amazing here. The ruling regime loves the people, and they love their leaders. Everyone stands behind the war against the cruel Israeli occupier and willingly sacrifices their lives to win their freedom. No one objects to Hamas firing rockets on Israel. Life is one big prison with massive shortages of food and other necessities, including a great shortage of red ink. And I think that one of the things that's already been mentioned by a number of the speakers is that, you know, it's one thing to be under conditions of intimidation, it's another thing not to mention it. Where is the journalists' red ink? Where are the journalists tonight? Where's Jody Rudorn tonight? Is Jody, are you here? No, I don't think so. Okay, my topic is intimidation. It was one of the big stories this summer. In the past, Israelis have complained about intimidation. I don't know if Judy Lash-Galant is here, but she wrote about this at the beginning of the Intifada. Everybody who remembers what it was like back in those days remembers that when the Ramallah lynching happened, they beat up the reporters, they smashed their stuff, they confiscated. One Italian crew snuck some stuff out. It immediately became a major story. The Palestinians were so angry that the crew of the Palestinian media agency, Mediaset, that had smuggled out the footage, actually had to take refuge in the Italian embassy in Tel Aviv. And in the meantime, the head of the other Italian news agency that was here, Riccardo Cristiano, wrote a letter to Yasser Arafat saying, we would never do anything like that. We always follow the procedures for journalistic reporting from the Palestinian territory. So the journalistic procedures, I'm going to call them the Hamas protocols. I think Tamar gave you a very good example of what that means. Gave you a very good example of what's involved. present the terrible suffering of the Palestinian people, blame Israel and present them as the brutal cause of this suffering, do not report Hamas activities, and the worse they are, the more you don't report them. And that means everything from the Ramallah lynching to launching rockets right outside of, right around kids, and in fact killing kids in the process, to the unbelievably vicious incitement. Camera was one of the first organizations, I think Camera caught this unbelievably negligent story by William Orm, the New York Times reporter, reporting on a speech by Sheikh Halabaya right after the Ramallah lynchings. It was a terrible speech, you know, kill the Jews wherever you find them, everywhere in the world, have no mercy, you know, real ranting genocide. And the only thing that Orm quoted in an article on incitement were the Palestinians inciting to kill the Israelis, reported that Sheikh Halabaya said, labor Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same, ... Left out the kill them wherever you see them. So there's this extensive, do not report Hamas activities, and above all, do not support the Israeli narrative. Now, one of the elements of the Israeli narrative is that the reporters are being intimidated, threatened with violence by Hamas. That's something that you cannot report, and that's actually my 5th protocol. Do not reveal intimidation. One of the rules of intimidation is omerta, silence. You are not to report that you've been intimidated, otherwise it destroys. If you write with red ink, it destroys the effect of what's happening. Now, this ability to intimidate the media, and I'm not saying that intimidation is the only thing, although I do think it plays a much greater role than we normally imagine, permits the Palestinians to pursue what Alan Dershowitz has called the dead baby strategy, what others have called a cannibalistic strategy, a strategy described by one Gazan, the only reporter with enough nerve to go into Gaza during Oferet Yitzhak, as the Hamas operatives fire on Israelis from the midst of civilians, hoping to draw fire back that will kill civilians so that they can accuse them of war crimes. Okay, now it's a staggeringly corrupt, cruel strategy. When you wonder why go about doing it just in order to be able to fire rockets at Israelis, you provoke the Israelis to fire back at you, you put your civilians in the way, and then you go to the media and say, look at what they've done to us, and you count on the media to report it the way you want it. Because if the media didn't report it the way you wanted it, then the whole strategy wouldn't work, because the strategy is meant to arouse outrage in the world, to bring an intervention from international diplomacy that forces the Israelis to move back, and so you end up with this mowing the grass because we're not allowed to go in there and actually weed out the problem. So this strategy of sacrificing your own civilians, maximizing civilian casualties on your own side can only work if the media doesn't review it. I'd like to give you an example of how that works. There was an incident during this war at the Shati refugee camp. There was an incident at the Shati refugee camp in which about 10 kids, real kids, we're not talking about 18-year-olds who come across in the statistics as children. We're talking about kids 10, 8 years old who were killed in Shati refugee camp right near Shifa Hospital. Also people killed in Shifa. Right now I'm only looking at the Shati refugee camp incident. They were killed by a Hamas rocket that was fired from there and then misfired. And that was established fairly quickly. Okay? Now, did we hear about it? We heard about it from two sources. One was the Israelis said it wasn't our fire, it was Palestinian fire, which the media handled by saying he said, she said. And then it was also revealed by what I think is the most eloquent tweet of the entire war by Gabriel Barbati, who wrote, out of hashtag Gaza, far from hashtag Hamas retaliation, far from Hamas retaliation, misfired rocket killed children yesterday at Shati. Proof, militants rushed in and cleared debris. Okay? Now, this is an incredibly dense piece of information. This is red ink. This is a story in which he says, first of all, I couldn't tell you about this as long as I was in Gaza because Hamas retaliation could get to me. Secondly, it was Hamas who killed their own people. And thirdly, Hamas actually has cleanup crews who come in and get rid of the evidence when they kill their own people. And we know this already during Amud Danan. There was a case of a boy who was disgustingly smothered with kisses by Haniya and the visiting foreign minister of Egypt, Sadala, who had in fact been killed by Hamas fire, and the crews came in and cleared it out. Now the media will tell you this, but they won't tell it to you in such a way as for you to understand the magnitude of the moral depravity of Hamas. To act in this way, what they'll do is they'll let you know that the Israelis disagree, and then they'll drop the story. So what happened with this Shati refugee camp? As long as they could say it was the Israelis, it was a terrible story. You saw pictures of fathers crying at the news that their children had been killed. As soon as it became clear that it was not Israel, the story got dropped. The one interview on the BBC, actually BBC TV, the one interview in which the BBC interviewed Mark Regev on this was run once. But what stories did they go for? They went for the stories where they could nail Israel, the school bombings, etc. Okay? So that's how it works. Now, the most significant aspect of this issue is somebody's tweeting about my talk. I'm trying to look at my timer and I keep getting The journalists deny that there's any intimidation. This is actually one of the most interesting aspects of this. It's been true for a long time. They've denied it for the entire last 15 years. I mean, in fact, the intimidation, if you want to know the origins of the intimidation, you must read Zev Chafet's book, Double Vision, about what was going on in Lebanon, which was an unbelievably brutal scene, a civil war that killed over 150,000, mostly civilians. There, the vast majority were civilians, over the course of 7 years, and in which the PLO played a particularly brutal role, but they protected the press. And there's a chapter in the book called The Commodore Hotel, which is where all the journalists stayed. It was the equivalent of the American Colony Hotel here, and the chapter was entitled Arafat's Best Battalion. And it was quoting Arafat saying, they're my best battalion. Okay, so they deny that there's any intimidation, and this came out in, again, one of the most eloquent, but not in the way she meant it, tweets from Jody Rudoran, who in response to an FPA statement that came out. I mean, I don't have time for this because it's a short presentation, but there's an immense amount of evidence that came out about intimidation of reporters this time around that had never come out before. 3 minutes left. All right, so I faded. The Foreign Press Association, which is not in any way Israel's favorite friend in this region. In fact, if you go and look for intimidation in media at the Foreign Press Association, previous to this statement that came out during the war, all of their statements about intimidation had been about Israeli intimidation of journalists. She wrote, "Every reporter I've met who was in Gaza during war says this Israel, now FPA narrative is nonsense." That's a really interesting quote, because as Tamar was pointing out, and you heard Hania say, our narrative has won. And one of the crucial protocols of Hamas, the Hamas media protocols, is do not support the Israeli narrative. And what the FPA did by showing the intimidation, by pointing to the intimidation of journalists, had actually undermined the Palestinian narrative and had actually supported the Israeli narrative. And for Jody, this clearly was well beyond the pale of acceptable behavior. And when she was pressed on it, she said she thought it was dangerous. And when she was pressed on whether she meant it's dangerous for reporters to admit that they're being intimidated, she said, no, I think it's dangerous because it undermines their credibility. In other words, it undermines the credibility of people who essentially are supporting the Palestinian narrative under conditions of coercion. All right, so I don't have that much time left. One of the things I wanted to talk about is that this is, in fact, a form of dhimmi behavior. The dhimmi, also known as dhimmi, but it's actually pronounced dhimmi. The dhimmi rules, we've heard a lot about the dhimmi rules. It's protection. I know, 1 minute. It's protection. It's protection from, what's it protection from? It's protection from violence. And what is going to trigger that violence? One of the most significant elements of what triggers violence from Muslims against dhimmi in Muslim majority societies is if you cause a Muslim to lose face. You cannot criticize a Muslim, you cannot criticize Islam, you cannot cause them to lose face or shame them because, as any honor shames of society knows, it is not only legitimate, it's expected, even required to shed someone's blood in order to save face. And so what you have here is a situation in which the media essentially is behaving as dhimmi. They are essentially reporting what the Muslim, in this case the jihadis, the Palestinian jihadis, the Hezbollah jihadis, the jihadis at war with Israel, are insisting they are reporting as not as in red ink, as Palestinian claims. They are reporting it in black ink as if it were true. And this has consequences not only for Israel, but consequences really for the entire world. It has consequences for the Palestinians, who are the most constant victim of the behavior of the Palestinian jihadis, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc. Not only does it victimize the Palestinians and obviously the Israelis, but it victimizes the democratic world. Because in fact, one of the big winners this summer of the behavior of the media in reporting the way that Hamas wanted them to behave, the greatest winner in this process was the global jihadis, not only ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but all the demonstrations that took place in the West in which really vicious anti-Semitic things were being howled out. In France, literally for hours, death to the Jews rang out in the streets of Paris, in the Place de la Bastille, allegedly the birthplace of freedom in the European West, and led to attacks on Jewish communities. So, if anything, this kind of profoundly immoral behavior on the part of the media, to deny this intimidation and to give into it and yet to produce news which they claim is real news when in fact it's counterfeit news, is a disaster for not just Israel and not just the Palestinians, but for the democratic world. Thank you.
Okay, great. There's good news. The graphics are back. So, I'm going to be talking about the Israeli perspective, or more accurately, how Israelis perceived the world media was reporting about them. I'll just begin to this. Talking a little bit about Perspectiva. Perspectiva is Camera's Hebrew language affiliate. We monitor the Israeli media for mistakes. Now, the reason why we needed that was that for many years we were seeing a pattern where time and time again Cameron was asking for corrections from international media, only to find that the mistake originated in the Hebrew press. And people were telling us, look, we're just reporting what the Israeli press is saying. I mean, If you want a correction, you have to go back to the source. So, Perspectiva was set up to correct those mistakes. Now, I just want to give you an example of a recent mistake from Protective Edge. The New York Times reported the story, which actually originated in Haaretz, of a righteous Gentile who returned his medal after some of his family were killed in a strike in Israel. Now, in the original, in Gaza, killed in a strike in Gaza. Now, the story actually started in Haaretz in its Hebrew website, the Hebrew paper, where Miraas correctly stated that one of the people who was killed there was actually a known terrorist. However, how did the New York Times get its mistake? Well, when Haaretz translated the story into English, they left out that all crucial detail about one of the people being a terrorist, and I'm going to quote, instead they just reported that the Israeli bombing killed a man who happened to visit the family that day. After Perspectiva and Camera contacted Haaretz, the piece was corrected, but alas, too late for the New York Times, and everyone read how Israel had killed the family of a righteous Gentile, completely missing the point that one of the people killed there was actually a known terrorist. Can you go back a second? Now, this is Perspectiva's mission. It's correcting the Israeli media and influencing, via that, influencing global coverage, but it's also a particular mission of Perspectiva is to help Israelis understand the larger context of how the world perceives the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, overall, the Israeli press is seen as very pro-Israel throughout Protective Edge. However, one thing that did come out is that Israelis were looking at the global media and asking, how come? Louder? Okay, I apologize. One thing that was coming out throughout Israeli media was the idea that the global media is just missing our message. Now, you just go to the next one. Yonit Levy is Israel's most famous and most influential news anchor. She recently published her theory in a tablet magazine about 2 wars happening. And during the 50 days of the war in Gaza, Israelis and the rest of the world were watching 2 completely different wars. Switch to the next slide. In Israel, the country was under attack and it was all happening on live television. The camera leads between different cities being targeted, showing the rocket's trajectory from the Gaza border, subsequent sirens, and civilians taking shelter in Israel, and often the rocket's interception by the Iron Dome anti-missile system several minutes later. Moments of deep anxiety, followed by relief, over and over throughout the day. However, what was the world watching at the same time? Far away in a different place. The world, in contrast, heard the story of Israel bombing innocent civilians in an Israeli-made prison and saw pictures of devastation inflicted by a military might. 2 different wars were happening, and Israelis were wondering how we were missing it. Can you go to the next one? Now, if you want a graphic that kind of summarizes everything we just said, this is from the Guardian's live blog on the Gaza war. This is from July 8th. This is the only picture of Israelis shown on that day of the war. The Israelis are shown sitting on the beach, suntanning, watching calmly as Iron Dome is destroying rockets, while the Palestinians are shown facing the real war. This is how Israel, or Israelis, felt. Now, this leads to our core question. Why did the world media miss the Israeli story? Now, I'm going to give an answer. It's not a comprehensive answer. It's not the only answer. But due to time limits, and also I want to leave something for Benjoy, we need to have to speak. I'm going to answer the question by answering that the world does not know Israeli society. In other words, they don't know us very well, and hence they have a very hard time reporting about us. Now, I'm going to give an example of how the world doesn't really get a true reflection of Israeli society. Anyone who reads the foreign media, and you don't even need to do a study, it's just clear out. The most frequently cited story, newspaper in Israel by the foreign press is Haaretz. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to entertain me for a second. How many, I'd like a show of hands, if you could just, 1 second, humor me. What percentage of newspaper readers in Israel do you think read Haaretz? If you think it's over 10%, can you raise your hand? Okay. If you think it's over 7%, can you raise your hand? over 5%. Okay, I can go to the actual figures. According to the latest TGI poll, during the weekdays, Israel's most read paper is Israel Hayom, close to 40%, Yediot Ahronot, 35%. After that comes the Israel Post. Israel Post, for most people probably don't know, is a free newspaper, basically a translated version of the Jerusalem Post, given out free in shopping malls, trains, and far behind, under 5%, Haaretz is 4.8%. However, despite the fact that Haaretz barely represents 5% of the Israeli population, it is by far the most cited news source. Now, just go to the next slide. We can see an example of what happens when you take a minority view and present it as the Israeli norm. Can you just play that, please?
Let's talk now about the murder of Tarek's cousin, Mohammed Abu Qadir. I want to read from today's editorial from Haaretz newspaper. Abu Qadir's murderers are not Jewish extremists. They are the descendants and builders of a culture of hate and vengeance that is nurtured and fertilized by the guides of the Jewish state, those for whom every Arab is a bitter enemy simply because they are Arab. Prosecuting the murderers is no longer sufficient. There must be a cultural revolution in Israel. How about that, Charles? There are a lot of Israelis, especially on the left, who think this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is part of the culture in Israel, hostility towards Arabs nurtured by Israeli politicians.
Look, I don't think that's true. The Israeli civil society, the government, wall to wall, everyone has condemned, totally condemned that murder. And my Prime Minister earlier today rang up the father of the
CNN, prime time, Israeli society presented as a, or I don't remember what the term was, a culture, filling hate.
But have you listened to Ruby Rivlin, the president, recently about the culture? Think about that. Don't deny the fact.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have questions at the end, otherwise we're going to have chaos. Could you please refrain from asking questions at this stage, please?
I'll answer that at the end. I'll remember to address you. I'm going to take 2 points from this example. Now, I happen to take Haaretz. There could have been other examples from other papers. But one point was that just the act of citing the Israeli paper automatically made the quote believable. Not only that, it made it seem like it was a representative analysis of the Israeli society. But the second point is just as important. Anyone who reads the Israeli press knows that Israelis are horribly prone to exaggeration. This is somewhat understood by Israelis who understand the language, they understand the context. So our example you've just seen shows what happens when exaggeration is translated into English and understood as reflective of Israeli society. And this brings us back to our original story. Another one, please. I posed my first answer as the world does not know Israeli society, but there's probably another answer which should also be thought of, which is all too frequently Israelis use loaded terms that are used definitely or erroneously by Israelis. Now I'm going to give you 2 examples together with the Haaretz example. Can you click the next one? The term apartheid. The term apartheid is used by Israelis, journalists, even politicians, most important people in Israel use the term. However, when Israelis use the term, they use it very loosely to mean any kind of discrimination between people. The term apartheid has a very clear meaning in international law, very clear meaning for most English-speaking educated readers, listeners. But Israel uses it differently, and as you can see, this quote is from the former Supreme Court President Dorit Beinish, who was trying to explain to a human rights group in front of the Israeli courts why they shouldn't be using the term. Now, the next example I want to show of Israeli hyperbole is the expression Jewish-only roads. At the top, you can see an example of an Israeli journalist, or ex-politician using the term. I could have given you dozens of examples from the Israeli press. We all know there aren't Jewish-only roads. There were in the West Bank a period where Palestinians were limited from using some roads. Distinction was not between Jews and everyone else. Israeli Arabs, Muslims, Christians could have used the road, but the term was used throughout the Israeli media. And from there, it was used, it made its way into the foreign press. Now at the bottom you can see one example of a correction. Thank you. You can see one example of a correction by the Associated Press. Both Cameron and Perspectiva have been chasing this mistake for years. We've been correcting it time and time again. I'm happy to say that in the Israeli press, it's now far less common. Most newspaper editors, after being corrected time and time again by Perspectiva, have learned to stop using the term. But this is a good example of how hyperbole by Israelis is translated into the international press. And it's just an example of how Israelis themselves often do it, often cause their own problems. Yes. We have to understand how we are heard by the world. It's not only a journalist problem, it's a problem by politicians as well. Oops. Okay, I'm almost finished. I'm going to be the one speaker to finish on time. So let's summarize. I've spoken of two causes of why the global media misses the Israeli story. The first is that Israeli society is not well known. Also, often journalists choose a media that seems to support their preconceived notions, even if it represents a small section of Israeli society. The second is Israeli use of hyperbole or highly inaccurate terms. Now, I don't have a great solution to either one of these problems. I mean, I'm very hopeful that the spread of English language news media, so can you go back a second? There are now more and more websites, news outlets in English that represent a larger class of Israeli society, which I hope will mean that journalists will have access to far more Israeli views and see a wider picture of Israeli society. But in the end, I'm not sure that will be enough. I think that when we sum it all up, both Israelis and foreign media outlets should aspire to a higher standard of journalism. This is true in Israel, it's true everywhere, but I think it's considering the complexity of Israeli life and the Israeli society, it is absolutely necessary for journalists to make the extra effort to understand. Especially for foreign journalists, should seek out a broader range of Israeli views, and Israelis must learn to avoid hyperbole if they want to be presented in the world as they are and not as some kind of exaggerated caricature. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Kamera, for this evening. I have to admit that, generally speaking, when I'm the last speaker, it's maybe because I'm the one who's supposed to answer all the previous speakers. But right now, I try to write something, some comments, in order to refute what the previous speakers said. But I'm jobless. I really have nothing to do because everything that I wanted to say actually has been said already. I do agree with the previous speakers. I'll try to do my best in order to give, in some words, the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is actually that it's not one operation, it's not caste-led operation, it's not Tzuketan, protective age operation. It's something which is much, much, much worse, because we are actually living in a world of lies, industry of lies. So many lies, it's just unbelievable. I want just to give some examples in order to understand what we are living through. The big lie, sorry that I have to begin with the Nazis, but I know that I'm violating the Godwin rule, but I have no choice. The big lie of the Nazis was that, they had to invent something. And what they invented is that actually the Jew is the great danger to humanity. It's called the big lie of the Nazis. There were many lies, but this one was the big one. If we keep on, can you Please push the button. If we can keep on, we see that actually the big lie is coming back, is coming alive. Just for example, Arun Gandhi, who is the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, wrote in the Newsweek, "We have created a culture of violence. Israel and the Jews are the biggest players, and that culture of violence is eventually going to destroy humanity." Same words as the big lie of the Nazis. He does not even distinguish between Israel and the Jews. Because many times we hear this kind of, "Oh, we don't mean Jews, what we mean is Israel, what we mean is Zionism." No, they don't even know what they're saying because they don't really distinguish many times. Let's go on. The same idea is actually was expressed by Claire Schott. She was a minister in the cabinet of Tony Blair. The oppression of the Palestinian people is the major cause of violence in the world. Wow, the same idea. Again, here is the source of problems of humanity. Let's go on. She even blamed Israel in the global warming. I have no idea what's the connection between Israel and the global warming, but when people are obsessed, it's all the way. Let's go on. And as has been said by previous speakers, yes, Israel is many times a source to the big lies. Israel's real purpose in Gaza attacks is to kill civilians. Just like that, you know, we are happy trigger. We like to kill civilians. We like to kill kids. Let's go on. One of the worst articles that was written during the operation was of Uri Avneri. And he actually compared the people of Gaza and Ahmed Haniya, as Ismail Haniya, to Churchill and the citizens of London, the inhabitants of London. Wow. So the conclusion is clear. The other side, which is Israel, is the Nazi side. Let's go on. But the lies are something which has nothing to do with any special operation. Let's go on. Just example of I guess you know this guy. He's now living in London and teaching in one of the universities of London. He's lying endlessly, repeatedly. Let's go on because we can skip it. I mean, let's go on. Lies and lies and lies, like Professor Joseph Nasser is coming from an Ivy League university. Some of you know it. Tel Aviv is the only Western city that does not have any Arab or Muslim inhabitants. I guess that the next article will be that in Jerusalem there are no Arabs. Let's go on. And he even wrote to his students that Netanyahu called to expel the 1.6 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. Did you ever hear about it? Let's go on. That's what Netanyahu said in the speech that Joseph Massad wrote about. The Jewish state of Israel will always protect the rights of all the more than 1 million Arab citizens of Israel. Let's go on. And it's go on and on. I guess this guy, some of you know, Robert Fisk from The Independent. And it's very interesting how he justified, actually, the rockets of the Palestinians. So when you hear the Israelis say the terrorists are firing rockets into Israel, the Palestinians in Gaza can say in many cases, well, my grandson is firing a rocket at my town because before 48 these areas would have been Palestinian property. It's very interesting, this kind of justification to terror. It's very interesting because, as we all know, and he knows, 20 million people only in Europe, only after the Second World War, were forced out of their homelands. But we never heard about ethnic Germans who fire rockets to Poland or to the Czech Republic. We never heard about so many Greeks or Turks that were forced out of their homelands firing rockets to the previous homeland. But he is giving justification to the Palestinians. Let's go on. Gaza is the worst, a very known professor in the United States, John Cole. Gaza is the worst outcome of Western colonialism anywhere in the world outside of Belgian Congo. Just to remind you that in Belgian Congo, 10 million people were killed by King Leopold of Belgium. Let's go on. And he is comparing. And the same idea is repeated, of course, by someone else that most of us know, John Mearsheimer, who wrote the very known book about the pro-Israeli lobby. What has happened to the Palestinian people since '48 is one of the great crimes of modern history. Wow, what a crime. More than 60 million people were forced out of their homelands. Millions were killed. But how come that this is one of the great crimes of modern history? This is a very known professor in the United States who is a kind of a public intellectual. That's how they call it, yes? Public intellectual. I mean, many times on TV and so. Let's go. The same professor said, very interestingly, that ethnically homogeneous state must be created. Creating homogeneous states would require drawing new borders and transferring population. Wow, what a hypocrite. What a hypocrite. Academically, he is supporting homogeneous states. Fair enough. There is a school of mind that he is supporting. And he's completely right. But when he is talking about Israel, it's becoming one of the biggest crimes. How comes that you recommend something which is, concerning Israel, is one of the biggest crimes? I asked him, by the way, he refused to answer. Let's go on. I mean, what we had, and we can skip it, it was a kind of a population exchange. More Jews were expelled, of course, forced out from Arab countries. But let's go on. We can skip it. And they were refugees, and it did not happen only to Palestinians. They were not even called Palestinians at that time. It happened to so many millions. It happened to more Jews than Arabs. It happened. But for him, it's one of the biggest crimes. Let's go on. Let's go on. We can continue. Let's go on. I mean, it's the same idea. I just checked the severity of every transfer of population exchange that happened during the last 100 years. And let me tell you, I mean, because he defined it as one of the greatest crimes. How many people killed in every transfer? I mean, this, and I'm saying it to people like Robert Fisk, like to Joan Cole, to Mearsheimer, and to so many other professors that repeat the same idea. Of course, here, Pape and others. And we can find out that so many people were killed in every transfer. It begins with 90% in the Armenian expulsion, and it goes on and on. And we can see that Israel did not commit any crime comparing to any other case of population exchange. Let's go on. And the outcome is that, of course, let's go on, let's continue, and as we all know, that Israel has this kind of image of, let's go on, that Israel has the worst influence on the world, and let's go on. And look, it was already mentioned here that Jeremy Boyle said, I saw no evidence of Hamas using Palestinians as human chicks. Let's go on. And then something which is very interesting that was written by James Davenport. From my point of view, it's a bit difficult to read, but I hope you can read it. Forming your opinion on the war on the basis of Jeremy Bowen's handwriting BBC News reports from Beirut, because he spoke about the Lebanon war, but the same Jeremy Bowen was also in Gaza, is a bit like deciding what you think of the Second World War based on local coverage of the firebombing of Dresden, as filmed with the full cooperation of Mr. Goebbels' press department. You know what? Not every foreign journalist is biased. Some of them are quite decent, and we have to remember it. Unfortunately, in that same article he wrote that he was the only one that in his community of journalists that expressed this idea. Everyone was sure that Israel is behaving like the Nazis. Let's go on. And my problem is not what they are publishing many times. This is not the problem. Because many times the problem is what they are not publishing. And what they are not publishing is something like, I don't know if we have time to see this video, the Hamas broadcasting again and again sentences like, let's go, kill the Jews, the Christians, the communists to the last one. And it goes on and on. Let's go. During the last operation, Protecting Age, they broadcasted the same idea. We have to kill the Jews, not the Zionists, not the Israelis, but the Jews. Let's go on. And this is something that they never showed. I think it was mentioned already. The guidelines of the Hamas, how to use civilians. The IDF limits, it's from the Hamas guideline. Somehow they never saw it. Somehow. The IDF limits the use of fire against civilian population centers. Wow, B'Tselem will never write something of the kind. We recommend to attack from there. Shooting from within homes of civilians is in Hamas' interest because it intensifies the hatred against the Israeli army. That's the Hamas. Let's go on. And the idea that we Jews are children killers is expressed again and again. This guy wrote, it's just unbelievable, gas chambers are not the only way to destroy a nation. It is enough to develop high rates of infant mortality. Again, we are Nazis. Let's go. And he keeps on in the last war. The people, the Israeli people, the Jewish people, I don't know what does it mean. The people demand some blood. Let's go on. Just to show, just in order, I mean, I don't want to leave it as it is, just in order to understand the contradiction between what he wrote and the reality. This is the real statistics about infant mortality, because that's what we wrote, that we actually increased the infant mortality among Palestinians in order to exterminate them. In reality, let's go on, it's not mine, it's coming from the World Bank data. It decreased dramatically, but it was published. And the same idea is published again and again, let's go on. No, we can skip it, let's go on, let's go on, let's go on, let's go on. Because I don't have time. Let's go on. 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 It was expressed. Let's go on. Let's go on. Let's go on. Just about proportions. Proportions. Let's talk about proportions. Last report about what the Americans are doing. From 2004 to lately. 2,379 were killed. Among them, only less than 300 were militants, combatants. So they are telling us, the State Department, they are giving us lessons about proportions. Look at yourself sometimes, please. Let's go on, let's go on. No, we don't have time. Let's go on, let's go on, let's go on. Let's go on. Let's go on. Okay, leave it. I don't have time, so I will tell just one thing. Gideon said that we need higher standards for journalism. You know, in one of my lectures in Berkeley, a student raised his hand and told me, "Oh, it's very nice, your statistics, and I have much more statistics about proportion." Leave it. It's all in my book, so that I'm mentioning it, but I have to. He told me, "Look, you know, it's very nice that you show us that you kill much less and so on and so on, but we hold you for higher standards." I told him, "Thank you that you hold me for higher standards, that you hold us for higher standards. But next to you, what's her name?" Because I knew exactly that he belongs to the JVP, but a student with a veil, hijab, was sitting next to him, and I asked him, "What's her name, please?" He told me, "Her name is Fatma." I told him, "Do me a favor, ask Fatma if she accepts that you will hold her religion, her culture, her state of origin for lower standards." I never received an answer. Thank you.
If you're not exhausted, you haven't been paying attention. It's been an intense time. We have about 20 minutes now. Please remember the comment that I threw away before. The Q stands for questions, and my obligation here is to encourage people not to make comments and statements. Now, there was a question down here, and I see two over there. Let's leave it for that moment, and then I'll ask you some more. But big voice, we have no microphone anyway.
I'll try my voice, it's not very high. I'm a spokesperson for an NPO called One State for Israel. And my question is, in Israel we have 39 million that we spend on publicity. And everything that all the speakers spoke about was very much like you have a fire and you have an incident and you basically answer it by correcting it or by doing something that is, solving the problem of the moment. But there's no pro-action on our side. At the beginning we saw video, and he said it so clearly in Arabic. Arabic is my first language because my parents come from Iraq. So I didn't need the translation, but he said it clearly. He said, everybody is helping me. The Jewish media is helping me. Outside is helping me. But who is helping us? How come we are not coming, and this is what we're trying to do, coming out and saying our narrative loud and clear. We're here because we have a right to be here.
To whom are you directing your question?
All of you guys, because every single one of us
is
a victim of that.
I'm going to suggest that whoever feels most enthusiastic about answering that question, if you've figured out the question, is entitled to speak. Go ahead, Richard.
Actually, I think what you wanted to do is ask the question, is anybody thinking beyond the sort of immediate response and putting out fires when they're lit? That's what, had I had another half an hour to talk, I would have gotten into about intimidation. I think intimidation is the Achilles heel of the media. There's a wonderful book, I'm going to be talking with the author of it, called The Elephant in the Room. And in fact, the media is forced to deny this elephant in the room, which is intimidation, which completely undermines their narrative. And they're forced to take stances like Jody Rudora's, which are really quite silly. But they get away with it because everybody, doesn't break rank. It's sort of like the Emperor's New Clothes. There's a great line, nobody wants to be the first person to say the Emperor's naked, and nobody wants to be the last person. And I think that what we have to do is think about how to create a kind of, a stampede on this issue of intimidation so that when somebody like Jody Rudoran wants to say, this is nonsense, she bites her tongue because she'll look like an idiot. Yes. So I do think that there are strategic things that can be done, but to be honest, we are still playing catch-up.
Okay. Another comment?
Yes, I think so many of the problems that we face are so deeply embedded that there is not a simple solution, a magic bullet to put everyone on the right page in terms of reporting responsibly and professionally. And the best things that we can do is to expose these problems and to continue with our sustained campaigns, to call the New York Times. You focus on certain targets, the most influential targets, because they lead the pack. And our efforts do yield results in institutional change. So for instance, people they often underestimate the value of corrections. And when we get a correction on a substantive issue, like what does UN Resolution 242 actually say? Does it require Israel to withdraw from all territories it gained in 1967? Does it require Israel to withdraw from the old city of Jerusalem? This has all been claimed in the New York Times. We were successfully able to obtain a series of corrections on this point. And I can tell you that misrepresentations about UN Resolution 242 are way down from what they were in 2000 when we were able to prompt that change. And that's no small matter, because UN Resolution 242 represents the backbone of all Arab-Israeli negotiations. So when you're able to leverage such a substantive change, that is a proactive step.
Thank you. The gentleman in red, I just want to say that there is a premium for somebody who wants to ask a question based on, I really think the committee is doing a great job. So.
Thank you very much. This was a great symposium, and all you folks do great work. There's an expression in the United States that says, if it bleeds, it reads. And you're not going to, it's going to be very tough to change the editorial content. There's a dichotomy in the press in the United States. I can't address the BBC. There's the dichotomy. You have the editorial people, and then you have the business people. And the editorial people, it's church and state. The editorial people continue doing what they want to do. But the business people, they're public companies, and they're under immense pressure.
And the question, please.
Yeah, I'll get there. But this is, I think, relevant. This is relevant. LA Times. LA Times just came out of bankruptcy. It's owned by the Tribune. It was another in Chicago. It was just a terrible, heinous article in the Orlando Sentinel this week by the Tribune company. They're owned by Oak Tree Capital, which is a major company.
Please, so the question.
The question is, when do we go after the source of who's running these companies? We're not going to win it at the editorial. We have to win it on the commercial situation. We have to take our data, and we have to go to Carlos Slim.
Would like to address the question with media.
Jeffrey Pugh. What?
Some goes to cards. It's not a secret, they're bankrupts.
I'd like it.
I can tell you, we have over the years met with top executives of leading media outlets, and I'll give you an example from the from CNN. Many years ago, we had been in a meeting with top executives, and then the executives of the CNN met with some local representatives of the Jewish community who were concerned about coverage, and they picked up our Media Report magazine, which is our flagship publication, and they said, see, we're not in here, so we're doing okay. So we do what you say in terms of meeting with the highest level and the people who are financially backing these institutions, but there's more that we can do, you're right.
Somebody with a real question. Okay, and then we go to the gentleman over there. No. Go on, be yours.
Question, directed to President Tamar, I think. The two most, to my mind, important media events this summer was one, Monty Friedman's article, which sort of said, the emperor has no clothes. I wish you would have been here tonight, it would have been fascinating to hear him. And the second one was something that I believe you sent out about an exchange that you had with the op-ed editor of the New York Times, where they basically said they won't be publishing an equal number of op-ed pieces, pro-Israel as opposed to anti-Israel, until there's a Palestinian state. In other words, don't bother me with intellectual honesty. I know the truth. I don't care what you say. Given that, given that there is no intellectual honesty, or it's a very rare commodity, let me phrase it like that, maybe perhaps targeting the New York Times, not so much with big posters, but to the Jewish community, boycott it, don't support it financially, put it out of business. Don't put your,
Waiting for that question, Mark.
Question mark, why don't you focus more on that as opposed to trying to correct it? They're not correctable.
We provide the data for people to make the decisions whether they're going to boycott. We generally, that's not our tactic to run out and encourage people to not buy newspapers. I'm not sure in the bottom line how much of a difference that makes. So the money comes from the advertisers. We do go after the money in instances, God's Jewish warriors. People might remember the Christian Amalpour series, which was gross distortion, putting Jewish terrorism, going back to cases from the 1970s on the same footing as world Islamic terrorism. And what did we do? We approached the advertisers. We laid out all the problems to advertisers, and they went to CNN and we said, we don't want to support this. And so CNN had to give them free additional advertising, and that hurt the pocket of CNN. So we can and we do take this route.
I guess I better, yes, you and then you, and then so I'm going to please.
I'd like to ask why the Israeli government, I'll direct this at Professor Landis or someone, has not used two magic bullets. I don't know how many of you here, like us, have seen the video of the redirection of guided missiles, and they watch where the terrorist runs into an apartment house or drives his vehicle next to a hospital so that they have to redirect the missile away, and it's wasted, and the terrorist gets away. They're showing how targeted we are to only go after the terrorists. And second of all,
turn it into a question.
The current thing with the Temple Mount, I don't know why our government doesn't say we go to the Temple Mount to pray for peace, and they attack us because they want to kill us and make war. This is war and peace. These are the two magic bullets that I don't understand why our government doesn't do anything about it. And I emailed it to the Prime Minister many times with no result.
I'm going to answer that very briefly. As Tamar said, there are no magic bullets. When there is no cost at slandering Israel and a high cost at telling the truth about the Palestinians, all the good arguments that we have will not avail until there are courageous members of the media who are not going to give in to the intimidation and not feed the almost endless appetite that especially Europeans, but alas the left, has for lethal narratives about Israel. All the good evidence that we have on our side will not make a whole lot of difference.
Okay, thank you. Question over there.
I believe that Mr. Gideon spoke about a tendency for us to share self-input. So my question is that it was mentioned how international media coverage of Israel is influenced by mistranslations, by exaggeration. To what extent is it influenced by an actual organized domestic agenda by groups like Peace Now, or that have an agenda, that have a goal to influence the domestic media, how that is been projected in the international scene?
Look, these groups are very good about selling what they do. I mean, every journalist is going to get their contact number and is going to get their press releases, and the Israeli government, I'm afraid, is very bad about answering these reports. I mean, a lot of the work of Perspectiva is often when you see a report in the foreign media and it's citing one of these human rights NGOs, we go and we ask the government for the response and we try and prove. I mean, the domestic issue is something that needs to be solved inside of Israel and its own political system. We can't do that. What we can do is to try and show the world what the answers are. And I do think that the Israeli government needs to step up and do more on this issue.
Yeah, if I could just add one comment on that. I do think that Jews have a tendency to engage in prophetic rhetoric, and Gentiles have a tendency not to understand that it's rhetoric. And they mistake a sort of rhetorical denunciation of how terrible we are by Jews who want us to be perfect for a reality, like the term apartheid. So I think that there is a really serious problem, and I think one of the things that we have to say to Gentiles is, look, it's not healthy for you to listen to these people and take them as your guide to reality. They will lead you to hell.
And we're in the last 5 minutes. Everybody should please understand a lot of passion in the room and many more questions than we can hope to answer to put. So I'm going to ask one over here, and the gentleman in the white shirt in the middle, and I can't do more than that.
A very brief question for Hadar. Your coverage of the BBC is excellent. Have you ever given any thought to expanding your coverage to France 24 in English? The reason why I ask is that is the one channel that I watch when I have opportunity to watch. They usually give extensive Middle East coverage. It's usually not too biased compared to the Beat especially. And during the war, it was terrible. And a follow-up to that, would you compare France 24 to Sky News, to the BBC in the future? See how they cover the exact same story.
I'm afraid covering the BBC is much more than a full-time job as it is. I mean, the amount of content is just absolutely incredible. I probably cover about maybe 5% of what they actually produce. It's just physically impossible for one person to do that. And I'm afraid I haven't much experience with France 24. I've seen a few things with France 24, but not an awful lot. I can't say I'm an expert. Sky was very, very bad during this last conflict. I know that. It's a question of resources. If we have resources, we'll be able to expand. But at the moment, there's just me covering the BBC, so that's, as I said, you keep it quiet.
I've got 2 more at the moment. There's one here. If you'll please ask a question, then we'll
Someone from Georgia asked about what the President of Israel said about violence in the Israeli society, and it was repeated just some days ago by the Education Minister, Shapiro. Unfortunately, yes, the two of them expressed the idea that the Israeli society is sick. Unfortunately, they have no idea what they are talking about, because according to the violence index, the level of violence in Israel is reduced every year. I know that the impression is of the opposite, but unfortunately, even people like the President, like the Education Minister, sometimes, unwillingly, they do help the demonization campaign. And let me tell you, they were already quoted in so many outlets, anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist outlets. How wonderful. Look, it's not us who say it, it's the Israeli president who is saying it. And yes, it is happening. So in Hebrew we say, Chachamim yizaru b'divrechem. Clever people just be cautious of what you say. Sometimes they are not so clever, unfortunately.
If I can just add one more thing. First of all, I apologize I forgot to get back to you at the end of my speech. But my point was that Haaretz represents a certain segment of Israeli society, and I have no problem with that. I respect their views, but Israel deserves to have all of its voices heard. And when one voice, and one very particular voice, is heard as if it represents Israeli society all the time, that just isn't journalism. If you want to represent Israeli society, if you want to ask about the true Israeli society, you have to give a wider viewing for all of the Israeli voices.
Okay, so we have a question here, and the gentleman in the middle, and then I'm going to take another few because we've just been given a small extension.
So my question actually goes to that. You mentioned that the figure was 4.8%.
Louder.
The figure was 4.8% of the readership is represented by Haaretz. I wonder what percentage of American readership is represented by the New York Times. And I'm wondering whether there is a certain identity between the writers of the editors of the New York Times who say, yeah, that Haaretz has a tiny representation, but they're the really thoughtful ones, right? They're the ones who really think this through. Of course they're going to be tiny. And they like fit by our model. How do we address that? If I'm making a reasonable presumption. Now, if I'm not, then I'm not. But I have a feeling that there's some of that going on. And if that is going on, how do we address it?
I think I gave an answer. The question was why, my understanding of the question was, perhaps Arabs get such a wide coverage in the foreign media because they represent a certain elite.
Because the New York Times, which also has a very small readership, percentage-wise in the American public, feels that way. That's my question.
I think I gave the answer at the end of my presentation. Some people are going to come convinced to Israel with their views and will seek out people who just reinforce their own views. We can't really do much about that. What we can do is to make sure that for people who truly come with open minds, they have the material available to them. I think in some fashion the spread of new Israeli media in English is heading that way. Times of Israel is very successful, Jerusalem Post. Ynet News, I wish it was translated a bit better, but it's also slightly spreading. And the only thing we can really do is to fight on the battlefield of ideas to present our views and hope they are picked up. Okay. Yes.
Yes, I want to ask a question. Why are you not calling this bias anti-Semitism? I have Professor Risley, just recently, a couple of years ago, published a book, The Legal Obsession of the Anti-Semitism, a tsunami of anti-Semitism in the world. Now, don't confuse me with facts. When I met President Peres, when it was a representative of more than 1,000 academics who were going to Oslo to protest the fact that I gave a Nobel Prize to Arafat, he said to me, this is only rhetoric. And I went to Mr. Chich, the mayor of Tel Aviv, and I told him that when there was fighting in Gush Etzion in 1948, the Arabs were calling and shouting, Ila Akbar, slaughter the Jews. Then he said, well, this is not an argument, you are a Holocaust survivor. So I am asking you, why are you not confronting the problem that is a typical anti-Semitic, and you call it sophisticated anti-Israel, but those are the problems you have to attack. Because if you are all the time explaining these figures and things like that, people that are not convinced by facts will not accept them.
Thank you. We have a
Because
sharp
they have
question.
an opinion, which means they have a bias.
Thank you.
I can express only my view about the question, why not to call it anti-Semitism? Because when we call it anti-Semitism, actually we have to give up. The moment that we call it anti-Semitism, actually there is not a lot to do. But let's remember, and at least I'm experienced with so many audiences, mainly in universities, American universities, that always there was something like 20% in the audience that are totally anti-Israelis. Some of them are Jews, JDP and others. Some of them SJP and there are some pro-Israelis. Always 10%, 20%. But there are so many students that are interested. They want to be informed. They have no idea. They are coming because they are interested. And some of them criticize Israel, but they want to hear. Now, if I will treat all of them as anti-Semites, I lost the case. I lost the battle. I don't want to lose it because I want to convince mainly those who are not totally biased against us. But if I will call them all anti-Semites, when at least half of the anti-Zionists are Jews, I'm losing the battle. I don't want to lose the battle. Even if, yes, I know, sometimes it's anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's a Jewish anti-Semitism. I know it. Believe me, I know it. And sometimes the most prominent people that lead the campaign against Israel, against the very existence of Israel,
Those who publish articles, even in the New York Times, against the very existence of Israel, are Jews. They allow themselves. Assad don't even allow themselves. The two last articles against the very existence of a Jewish state that were published in the New York Times were written by Jews. So we cannot forget it.
But this is the whole history is going on.
So,
not only Jewish self-hatred, which is it?
All right, excuse me, if we can answer your question. As a medievalist, I can assure you I do not ignore the existence or the role or the dynamics involved in anti-Semitism. I agree with Ben Hall that given the situation right now, given how many people have been sucked into this view of Israel as the Goliath/Nazi, and the overwhelming adherence of the press to this, you have a lot of people who do not think that they're anti-Semitic and may even not be, but they don't know how to think their way out of it. What I try and do is to point to, and it was an interesting quote from the Hamas guy about how, you know, the Palestinians feed the thirst of the Western media. I talk about the thirst of Westerners for what I call moral schadenfreude, which is the sort of pleasure, simcha la'ed, the pleasure that people take in demeaning Jews and criticizing them and putting them down and degrading them. I don't talk about self-hating Jews, I talk about self-degrading Jews, because they degrade themselves in front of other people in an effort to curry favor with them. And I think that the important thing to do is to say to people, look, this is the path to anti-Semitism. When you just love lethal narratives about Jews, makes you feel good, makes you feel morally superior for the president or for the Secretary of State to point to Israel and say, hell of a pinpoint bombing campaign, when in fact they conduct much cruder campaigns. If that makes you feel good, then you really have to question your own motives. But I don't think that it makes sense to actually accuse people of being anti-Semites. I think it's more important to get them to realize how they're being tempted by anti-Semitism and how to stop letting themselves be tempted.
If I can ask the gentleman up here to ask a question, that may be the last question. I actually meant the gentleman behind.
Two very short questions for Ben Yamini. Number one, when are you going to become the official government spokesman? And number two, and number two, when is your book going to be published in English?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be the spokesman of the government because I don't think that my views can represent the Israeli government. In some aspects, I'm a right-winger. In some aspects, some people here maybe know, I'm a left-winger. So I'm not sure that I'm the right person to represent something at all. And I have this kind of tendency, sickness, that every morning I'm changing my views. So when people are telling me that they identify with me in 100%, I'm telling them it's much more than me. So it's a problem. Now about my book, I just came 2 days ago from New York. I signed a contract. It will take some time, but the book is in good hands. That's what I can tell you, and I hope quite soon, but soon, it's some months, it will be published in English.
Okay. If you can ask a short question,
It's going to be a short question. It may require a long answer. In this month, there was an event where it was allowed to be leaked to the press that various administrative figures considered Netanyahu to be chicken shit. My question, and there is a question here, is how much people like you should also be dealing with indirect attacks against Israel, particularly against Benjamin Netanyahu, whether you support him or not, he is standing in for Israel.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator to kind of subvert that question by segueing into what I was going to finish with in the end. There are very few organizations in the world of trying to present Israel's case that do it with quite the sophistication and panache that CAMRA does. Now, I'm not an employee or even an associate of CAMRA, but I've seen it from up close. I once had the privilege of doing a tour of a number of cities on behalf of CAMRA, and there's no one who comes close in terms of trying to affect the public discourse. It's a big mistake for people like us to sit here in an auditorium like this and say, why don't you? Because camera is all about saying, here's what you can be empowered by, here's what we can do in order to help change the direction of the discussion. Now, I happen to know that camera is holding workshops here in Jerusalem in the near future. There are flyers to describe this outside, which give people the tools for engaging in letter writing. Now, letter writing is clearly, in the age of digital media, not the only way in which we can have an effect. And if there's anyone who's taken the trouble to go out on a night like this, and he doesn't tweet or blog, then shame on you. Because we all have the capacity to influence the public debate, the public discourse, and to have our views heard. If you've paid any attention to where all the noise is coming from on the other side, it isn't Jeremy Bowen. There are hundreds of thousands of people who want to be Jeremy Bowen, who are at universities, who are in trade unions, who are in churches, who are just people who live on the street or in some town. We really lack this in the Jewish world today. We have so much emphasis in the wrong place where people are saying, why don't you? Referring to those Jewish organizations. I think that everyone here deserves a round of applause for the restraint that's been evident here in this room. It's a passionate, important discussion, the kind of discussion that, as I said at the beginning of my comments, affects all of us, whether we want it to be part of our destiny or not. It's been made our destiny. But the speakers were the ones who went to the trouble to prepare for this evening. I think everyone will agree they've prepared and disciplined themselves remarkably well. And I want to ask everybody to just join in a round of applause for them, as well as ourselves. There's a lot of material outside, including Ben-Gurion Yemini's book, which is available for sale. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. Good evening.